Hello everyone, welcome to today's video. This is me Namitha from Orchids International Schools discussing the previous year questions from the subject biology from the chapter Heredity for the CBSE board examination preparations for the academic year 2024-2025. So, the chapter Heredity carries 7 marks in the CBSE board examination for the science subject, and when it comes to the subject of biology, 7 marks is very important and this chapter carries that whole 7 marks. When we look into the syllabus of science, we can see that this particular chapter carries only 7 marks. At the same time, the topics covered in this particular chapter are very less in number. The topics and the content of this particular chapter is very less, but there is still 7 marks coming from this chapter. That makes all those topics very important. When it comes to this chapter, the major topics covered are variation, the reasons for variation, genes, chromosomes, and then the laws of Mendelian inheritance, the role of Mendel's experiments in these laws, also monohybrid cross, dihybrid cross. Along with that, we have one more topic which is the most important topic, that is sex determination. In this video, mainly I will be discussing the MCQ questions which may carry 1 mark. Also, I will be discussing the 2-mark questions, 3-mark questions and 4-mark questions. From this chapter, mostly 5-mark questions are not found or not mostly found in the CBSE board exam papers. So let's move on to the MCQ questions first. So this is the first MCQ question. The statement that correctly describes the characteristics of a gene is, they have given us 4 options over here. In individuals of a given species, a specific gene is located on a particular chromosome. The second statement is, a gene is not an information source for making proteins in the cell. The third statement is, each chromosome has only 1 gene located all along its length. And the fourth statement is, all the inherited traits in human beings are not controlled by genes. This question is from the CBSE board exam paper of 2023 academic year. So let's look into each of these questions. Let's look the first statement, the statement A. In individuals of a given species, a specific gene is located on a particular chromosome. When we are analyzing this particular statement, we can understand that the statement is true. Let's look into the other statements and compare whether the other 3 statements are wrong or correct. The second statement is, a gene is not an information source for making proteins in the cell. This statement is wrong because we know that a gene actually carries the information source for the protein synthesis by the cell. And the third statement is, each chromosome has only 1 gene located all along its length. This statement is also wrong because we know that there are multiple genes in one single chromosome. And then comes the fourth statement, that is, all the inherited traits in human beings are not controlled by genes. And thus we came to this conclusion that the fourth statement is also wrong because all the inherited traits in human beings are controlled by genes. Thus, we got the answer to this particular question, that is A. The answer to this particular MCQ question is A. In individuals of a given species, a specific gene is located on a particular chromosome. Now, let's move to the next question. The second question is also an MCQ question. Here, they gave us 2 statements and they are asking us to consider the 2 statements and give an answer to the question. Consider the following 2 statements. The first statement is the trait that expresses itself in F1 generation, and the second statement is the trait that keeps on passing from one generation to another. We have to find out the appropriate terms for the statements 1 and 2 respectively. That is the question. And they have given us 4 options. A is recessive trait and dominant trait. B is dominant trait and recessive trait. C is dominant trait and inherited trait. D is recessive trait and inherited trait. This question is from CBSE 2023 question paper. So let's see what could be the answer for this question. First, let's consider the first statement, the trait that expresses itself in F1 generation. we know that the trait that expresses itself in F1 generation is the dominant trait. So let's conclude that A and D options are not valid in this case. Then we have B and C options over here. They have dominant trait in the first part, and then in the second part it is recessive trait or inherited trait. The second statement, the trait that keeps on passing from one generation to another. You may get confused over here. You may think that it might be recessive trait. Some people may think that it could be inherited trait as well. So what could be the answer to this particular question? The trait that keeps on passing from one generation to another, actually it is the inherited trait, because we know that the recessive trait will not be passed on to all the progenies of the F2 generation in case of monohybrid crows and also in dihybrid crows. So in this situation, we can understand that the trait that keeps on passing from one generation to the another, that keeps on, the word is very important, that keeps on passing from one generation to another, it will be the inherited trait. So the answer to this question is option C, the dominant trait and inherited trait. Coming to the next question, we have another MCQ question, but this is an assertion reason question. We have the assertion A given here as genes inherited from the parents decide the sex of the child, and the reason R is X chromosome in a male child is inherited from his father. We should find out which is the correct option. In this case, we have different options given over here, and this question is from CBSE 2022 question paper. Here, when you look at this question, we have option A, both A and R are true, and R is the correct explanation of A. And in B, we have both A and R are true, but R is not the correct explanation of A. And now in C, we have A is true, but R is false. And in the option D, we have both A and R are false. This option is not much common in the CBSE board exam papers, but we can see this kind of questions multiple times in the CBSE question papers from this particular chapter. So now we have to find out whether A and R are correct or wrong, and we have to analyze the assertion and the reason. The assertion given is genes inherited from the parents decide the sex of the child, and the reason is X chromosome in a male child is inherited from his father. This is actually a confusing question. Again, you may feel like the assertion is right. Genes inherited from the parents decide the sex of the child. Once you hear it, you may feel like, yeah, this assertion is right. But the problem is, genes inherited from the parents not completely decide the sex of the child. It is actually the chromosome, the Y chromosome from the father decide the sex of the child. So when it comes to this assertion, it's partially correct, not fully correct. And the reason given here is X chromosome in a male child is inherited from his father. That is completely false. It is the Y chromosome from the father that determines the child's sex. The Y chromosome in a male child is inherited from his father. So in this case, both assertion and reason are proved as false. The assertion is not completely right. The assertion given here do not clearly provide an information regarding the inheritance of the genes from the parents that decides the sex of the child. So the answer to this question is option D, both A and R are false. I hope you understood why the answer came. Now let's move on to the next set of questions, the 2-mark questions from the chapter Heredity. The first question from the CBSE 2022 question paper for the 2-mark question from the chapter Heredity is, what is variation? List 2 main reasons that may lead to variation in a population. This question has 2 parts and each part carries 1 mark each. So what is variation? That question part carries 1 mark, and the main reasons, listing the 2 main reasons that leads to the variation carries 1 mark. So in this case, we have to keep that in mind. that we have to write the answers properly and also underline the keywords with a pencil. This is the answer that you can refer on to. Variation is the degree of differences in progenies and between a progeny and the parents. This is something that we all are aware of or we are familiar with. Variations are the degree of differences in between the progenies and between a progeny and the parent too. And next, the second part of the question, we have to list down the main reasons. They have given us the number, 2 main reasons that may lead to the variation in a population. The 2 main reasons for variations are, first one is mutation and then comes the genetic combinations through crossing over that happens during the meiosis of sexual reproduction. So we have 2 main reasons for the variations. One is mutations and the other one is genetic recombinations. You can mention crossing over also over there, but the genetic recombinations that results from the crossing over in the meiosis is the actual reason. So to get full marks, you have to mention the genetic recombinations through the crossing over during the sexual reproduction. Now, let's move on to the second question from this section, which is the survival of a species is promoted through creation of variations. Illustrate with an example. This is the previous year CBSE board examination question papers question, CBSE from the CBSE 2024. And when we look into this 2-mark questions from this particular chapter, we can see that most of the questions are repeatedly coming either from sex determination portion or from the variation portion. We are not getting much questions from dihybrid cross or monohybrid cross in the 2-mark section. So let's move on to the answer of this question. We have to illustrate with an example that the survival of a species is promoted through the creation of variations. It's always safe to take the example that is given in the textbook. So we have the example of the population of bacteria given in the textbook, and it clearly says that the population of the bacteria that living in temperate waters that can withstand the heat due to the rise in temperatures because of global warming will survive better in a heat wave than the non-variant bacteria without the capacity of heat wave tolerance. Thus, suitable variations promotes or supports survival of species. As this question is of 2 marks, you don't have to explain everything that came under this particular topic from the textbook. You should summarize what is exactly given in the textbook based on this particular incident or case study, and then you have to find an answer to this question or frame an answer to this particular question. You can just mention that the bacteria population which has the heat resistant capacity can survive better than the other ones which are not heat resistant enough. In this case, it's always better to underline the keywords like the population of bacteria having the capacity to withstand heat, that's surviving better than the non-variant bacteria without the capacity of heat wave tolerance. These are the keywords that you can underline with a pencil in this particular question. Thus, we have come to the end of the 2-mark question section. Now let's move on to the next session, which is the 3-mark questions from the chapter Heredity that came multiple times in the CBSE main board examinations. So this is the first question. List 2 differences between dominant traits and recessive traits. And the next part of this question is, what percentage of pea plants in the F2 generation was with yellow seeds in Mendel's cross between plants having yellow capital Y and green small y colored seeds? This question is from the CBSE board examination of 2024. Let's see how to write the proper answer to this particular question. When you look into this particular question, you can see again 2 parts for this question. You may feel like, okay, fine, first part is there, second part is there, what could be the mark distribution? When you look into the first question itself, list 2 differences between dominant traits and recessive traits. From that itself, we can understand that it carries 2 marks. They are asking us for 2 differences between dominant traits and recessive traits. And then comes the next question. The statement of the question seems to be so big, but it carries only 1 mark because they are asking us the percentage of the pea plants in the F2 generation. And they gave us the cross also. In this cross, when we analyze this question, we can understand that this was a monohybrid cross between a yellow seeded and a green seeded plant parent combination. So this is a monohybrid cross. They are asking us the percentage of the pea plants in the F2 generation with yellow seeds. So even though the question is so lengthy, the answer is very simple and it is very easy to find out that answer too. This part of the question carries 1 mark and the other part carries 2 mark. This section listing two differences between dominant trait and recessive trait carries 2 mark, and it is one of the most important section also. These kind of questions can be found repeated in multiple sets of the question papers of multiple years in the CBSE board examinations in different frames, in different types of sentences, incorporated in different questions, incorporated in different sections. This particular question is very important. We are going to find out how to frame the answer to this particular question. So this is the way that we are going to answer this particular question. These are the two differences between dominant traits and the recessive traits. So whenever you are getting a differentiating question, it's always good to draw a table and differentiate the points. Here itself we can understand between dominant trait and the recessive trait, the first difference was when both dominant and recessive traits are inherited, the dominant trait gets expressed. This is something that we all are familiar with. We know that dominant trait will get expressed even though there is one recessive trait over there, and dominant trait has the capability of suppressing the recessive trait. That is the first difference. When it comes to the recessive trait, when both dominant and recessive traits are inherited, the recessive trait does not get expressed. So this is the first difference that you can write for this question. And then comes the second difference. A single copy of dominant trait is enough to get it expressed, and the next difference coming under the recessive trait is both the copies of a trait should be recessive to get it expressed. This is also a very simple point. We know that if at least one dominant trait is there, it will express itself, whereas in recessive trait both the genes of the allele should be recessive, then only it will be expressed. So this is the two difference between dominant trait and the recessive trait. Now this is the answer to the first part of the question, that is difference between dominant trait and the recessive trait. Now we have the second part of the question. Let's move once back to this question. The second part of the question was finding out the percentage of the pea plant in the F2 generation with yellow seeds in Mendel's cross between plants having yellow and green colored seeds. As I said before, this is a monohybrid cross and we are crossing these two parent plants and we have to find out the F2 generation with yellow seeds. I don't think that we have to do the entire monohybrid cross in the answer paper for this, because we know that in F2 generation the phenotypic ratio is 3:1. That clearly means that the percentage will be 75% of yellow seeds. Already in the question they gave that the dominant trait is yellow and the recessive trait is green. So we know that in the F2 generation, in the 3:1 ratio, the 3 stands for the yellow seeds itself. So the plants with yellow seeds in the F2 generation will be 75% out of the whole. So 75% of yellow seeds will be the result of the F2 generation and the plants with yellow seeds will be 75%. Coming to the next question from this session. This is the second question from the 3-mark section. Let's read it once. Mendel crossed pure tall pea plants capital T with pure short pea plants small t and obtained F1 progeny. When the plants of F1 progeny were self-pollinated, plants of F2 progeny were obtained. Question A is, what did the plants of F1 progeny look like? Give their gene recombination. Question B is, why could the gene for shortness not be expressed in plants if in F1 progeny? Then the third question is, write the ratio of the plants obtained in F2 progeny and state the conclusion that can be drawn from this experiment. This is again CBSE 2024 question. So let's look into this question. From this question itself, again when we analyze the question, we can understand that this is a question from monohybrid cross. So let's analyze the question. Here the parent plants are having capital double T genetic combination and small double t genetic combination, and Mendel crossed pure tall pea plant with pure short pea plant, and we have to find out what is the physical appearance of the F1 progeny. Also we have to find out the gene combination of the F1 progeny. As Mendel already obtained the F1 progeny and we know how to find out the F1 progeny. Let's do it once. We have one parent over here crossed with the next parent. These are the gametes and this will be the F1 progeny. So we know that in this case capital T is already dominant over here. So capital T's character is tall pea plant. So the phenotype of this plant will be tall. We already got the answer to the question A here. The question A was, what did the plants of F1 progeny look like? Give their gene recombination. So what does it look like, which means what is the physical appearance, what is the phenotype of F1 progeny? The phenotype is tall and their gene recombination capital T small t. So this is the answer for the question A. And question B and C, let's see how to answer these questions. This is how you have to answer or frame the answers to this particular question. So in the F1 progeny, as per the F1 cross, monohybrid cross, as per the monohybrid cross done by the Mendel, in the F1 generation, all the progenies, all the plants were tall and their gene recombination was TT. Then the next part of the question, the B question was, why could the gene for shortness not be expressed in the plants in F1 progenies? Why in the F1 progeny we didn't get the shortness trait? The reason is again very simple. We know that shortness is a recessive trait and it will be expressed only if both the genes in the allele or both the alleles are actually short, which is small double t. Shortness is a recessive trait which will be expressed only if both the genes are recessive. So in this case, one dominant gene is present, which is capital T, and it is dominant over the recessive, which means the dominant gene can suppress the recessive gene from expressing itself. So in this case, as one T is present, which is a dominant trait, the shortness trait wasn't expressed. This is the answer to the second question. Now let's move on to the third part of this question, the question C. Write the ratio of the plants obtained in F2 progeny and state the conclusion that can be drawn from this experiment. So we are going to find out the F2 generation that we get by self-crossing the F1 progeny. We already got the F1 progeny and the F1 progeny was capital T small t, and we are going to self-cross it. By self-crossing it, we will find out the F2 generation. So this is the F1 progeny. We are self-crossing it with the other plant in the same generation or with the same plant itself, and we have 4 gametes in this case, 2 from one plant and these 2 from the other plant, and we are crossing it. This is the first cross and we have capital T as the first F2 progeny, and then again in this probability we have capital T small t as the F2 progeny, and this is the next probability, capital T small t again, and the last probability, which is the small t small t. So we know that this is the probabilities of F2 progenies. These 4 type of genetic recombinations we can find in the case of F2 progenies, and the characters will be tall, tall, tall and dwarf, which means we get 3 tall plants and 1 dwarf plant or short plant. So the phenotypic ratio will be 3:1, and the genotypic ratio will be 1:2:1. So for the question C, let's read the question C once again. Write the ratio of the plants obtained in F2 progeny and state the conclusion that can be drawn from this experiment. They didn't ask us which kind of ratio they require. They didn't ask us whether it is phenotypic or genotypic. So in this case, we are going to write both the ratios, and we are going to find out the conclusion that we got from we are going to write down the conclusion that we drew from this particular experiment in the answer of question C. As we got 3 tall plants and 1 short plant, the phenotypic ratio was 3:1, and the genotypic ratio was 1 capital double T is to 2 capital T small t is to 1 small double t, which is 1:2:1. The conclusion is tall trait is dominant and short trait is recessive. This is the very important that we come as the conclusion. Tall is the dominant trait and short is the recessive trait, and this is a monohybrid cross conclusion. Thus, we have come to the end of the 3-mark questions section. Now, let's move on to the 4-mark questions section, which is the case-based questions. As I said already in the introduction, most of the questions from this particular chapter comes in 1-mark section or 2-mark section or in 3 marks or 4 marks. We are not able to find much questions in the 5-mark section from this particular chapter. But when it comes to case-based questions, most of the years, in most of the question papers, we can find at least 1 question from this particular chapter of heredity. It will be based on monohybrid cross or dihybrid cross. They will give us one particular case, and they will ask us to analyze that whole question, that whole situation or case, and they will give us multiple questions based on that particular case, and then we have to find out the answer to that particular question. Now, here, let me show you one 4-mark question that came in CBSE 2023 question paper. This is the case that they gave us. Let's go through the case once. In order to trace the inheritance of traits, Mendel crossed pea plants having 1 contrasting character or a pair of contrasting characters. When he crossed pea plants having round and yellow seeds with pea plants having wrinkled and green seeds, he observed that no plants with wrinkled and green seeds were obtained in the F1 generation. When the F1 generation pea plants were crossbred by self-pollination, the F2 generation had seeds with different combinations of shape and color also. Now, let's analyze this question once. When we are reading this question, first itself they gave us one clue that it is a Mendel cross. So, it could be based on monohybrid cross or dihybrid cross. The first statement is about the Mendel's crosses based on 1 contrasting character or a pair of contrasting character. Then the next statement starts like, when he crossed pea plants having round and yellow seeds. Here itself you can see 2 characters. And then the next plant with wrinkled and green seeds. So from this itself we can understand that the case is on a dihybrid cross. Let's move to the next statements. He observed that no plants with wrinkled green seeds were obtained in the F1 generation. Here they gave us the F1 generation. There was no wrinkled green seeds, which means all the seeds were round and yellow. And then when the F1 generation pea plants were crossbred by self-pollination, the F2 generation had seeds with different combinations of shape and color also. So F2 had multiple gene recombinations. So this is what we understood from this particular case. Now let's see which are the different questions that came in this case-based question. The first question is, write any two pairs of contrasting characteristics of pea plant used by Mendel other than those mentioned above. The second question, differentiate between dominant and recessive traits. The third question, state the ratio of the combinations observed in the seeds of F2 generation in the above case. What do you interpret from this result? Or we have an OR question for this third question. Given below is a cross between a pure violet flowered pea plant, capital V, and a pure white flowered pea plant, small v. Diagrammatically explain what type of progeny is obtained in F1 generation and F2 generation. And they gave us the phenotype and genotype of the parents too in this case. So let's analyze the first question. The first question is very simple and it's a theory-based question as well. Write any two pairs of contrasting characteristics of pea plant used by Mendel other than those mentioned above. Already they gave us the color of the seeds, round, yellow and green wrinkled. So now we have to take the other two pairs of contrasting characteristics of pea plant used by Mendel other than the ones mentioned there. We have already 7 contrasting characters taken by the Mendel to do his crosses. So in this case, I gave you 2 options. They are asking us actually 2 pairs of contrasting characteristics. So in this case, I am writing here 2 options, the pod color, green and yellow, height, size of the plant, tall and dwarf. But in this case, you can write any from all those 7 contrasting characters that Mendel took for his experiment other than the color of the seed which is green or yellow, or the size or the shape of the seed which is round or wrinkled. Now let's go to the next question, the B question. Here the question was to differentiate between dominant and recessive traits. Already this question was discussed before. And when I discussed it, I already told you that this question was repeated in multiple question papers in multiple ways in different sections. So again, we are seeing another place where we are finding the same question, differentiating between dominant and recessive traits. When we are differentiating, as I already said, we have to make sure that we are making a table and then we are differentiating them. Dominant trait in one side and the recessive trait in one side, and then we have to differentiate them. Dominant trait, when both dominant and recessive traits are inherited, dominant trait gets expressed, and in recessive trait, when both dominant and recessive traits are inherited, the recessive trait does not get expressed. This is the first point to be mentioned, and the next point is a single copy of dominant trait is enough to get it expressed, whereas in recessive trait we need both the genes as the recessive to get expressed. These points are very important. Study it properly, differentiating between dominant trait and recessive trait, or at least one question based on dominant trait or recessive trait will be there in the board examinations. It's been repeated in continuous examinations of CBSE boards. So this is the answer for the B question. The B question was differentiating between dominant and recessive traits. Now we have 2 options for question C. First is state the ratio of the combinations observed in the seeds of F2 generation in the above case. What do you interpret from this result? Now let's see the answer for the C question. The ratio of combinations in this case is 9 round yellow, 3 round green, 3 wrinkled yellow, 1 wrinkled green. That is 9:3:3:1. So we already said that this is a normal dihybrid cross, and we know that what is actually the phenotypic ratio of the dihybrid cross. They are asking us the ratio of the combinations observed in the seeds of F2 generation in the above case, in the given case. So we are just writing that over there. We don't have to do the cross, or we don't have to illustrate or demonstrate anything over there. Just state the ratio which we already studied over there, that is 9:3:3:1. And the next part of the question is, what do you interpret from this particular result? The interpretations are these. Round yellow are the dominant traits and wrinkled green are the recessive traits. This is the first conclusion that we come across when we are doing a dihybrid cross. And then the next conclusion or the interpretation that we come from the dihybrid cross is, multiple traits in the plants crossed segregate from each other and independently assert themselves and get inherited to the next generations. This results in new combinations in F2 generation. So this answer itself is the clear indication of the Mendelian inheritance. So we know that in the F1 generation there was only round yellow characters expressed, or the parents were round yellow and green wrinkled. But when it came to the F2 generation, rather than the parent characters like round yellow or green wrinkled, we got two new combinations also, which were round green and wrinkled yellow. So these are the new genetic recombinations that we got in the dihybrid cross. And how that came? Because of the segregation of these characters independently and moving to the next generation. So that comes as the second interpretation of the dihybrid cross. Multiple traits in the plants crossed segregate from each other and independently assert themselves and get inherited to the next generation. This results in new combinations in the F2 generation. So this is the answer for the C question, and we have one more option for the C question. Let's say if we are not going to take this C question, we are going to attempt the second C question. What could be the answer for this question? Here they are asking us to diagrammatically explain the type of progeny that we obtain in the F1 generation and F2 generation as well. And the cross is between a pure violet flowered plant and a pure white flowered plant. This itself says that this is a monohybrid cross. We are going to cross between a pure violet flowered plant and a pure white flowered pea plant. So they are asking us to diagrammatically explain the monohybrid cross between the pure violet flowered plant and pure white flowered plant. They gave us the genotype as well. We should find out the F1 and the F2. Let's see how to find the answer, or what could be the answer to this question, how to write the answer to this particular question. So here is how we are going to diagrammatically solve this particular question. We have pure violet parent plant crossing with pure white plant. The genotype is already written, capital double V, and the pure white's genotype is small double v. And the gametes are capital V and small v. And in the F1 generation we got the violet plant, the phenotype will be violet, and also the genotype will be capital V and small v. And then we have to do the F1 self cross. This is the F1 generation. We already found out what could be there in the F1 generation. The phenotype also is there and the genotype is also there. And the phenotype ratio is not needed over there because all the plants will be violet. Then we are moving on to the F1 self cross. Capital V small v is crossed between capital V small v plant, and then we are getting the F2 generation over here like this. These are the gametes getting crossed and we get capital double V, capital V small v 2 and 1 small v small v. The phenotype is, we have 3 plants with violet and 1 plant with white physical character. The flower is violet in 3 plants and white in 1 plant. So we are going to write the phenotype ratio, 3 violet is to 1 white, 3 is to 1, and the genotype ratio 1 capital double V is to 2 capital V small v is to 1 small double v. That is 1 is to 2 is to 1. So in this In this question, they asked us to diagrammatically explain what type of progeny is obtained in F1 generation and F2 generation. We already diagrammatically explained everything, and also we provided the phenotypes, the genotypes, the ratio and of the phenotype and the genotype as well. So in this particular diagram itself, everything is there for this particular question. F1 generation is there, F2 generation is there, F1 generation's genotype and the phenotype is there, F2 generation's genotype and phenotype is there, phenotype ratio and genotypic ratio of the F2 generation is also there. So this is how we are going to answer the C part, second part of the or second option of the C part of this particular case based question. Thus, we have come to the main question from the case based question also. You will be able to find out many such questions from different sample question papers or previous year question papers when you are trying to solve the question papers or for the preparation of board examinations. All these questions actually help you to practice more on the same topics that you have already studied. And it's very important for you people to practice these question papers, because in the case of CBSE, most often questions will be repeated in different ways in different sections. Even though the question sections will be different, even though the marks are different, the type of the questions or the essence of the questions or the answers for these questions will be almost the same, because the chapters are always the same. So if you practice these questions, it's very simple for you to grab out of out or 100 out of 100 in the case of the science question paper, in the case of science board examination. When it comes to biology, if you study the theory and if you practice more question papers, you will be able to score more marks than the others if you are focusing more on the previous year questions. So we have come to the end of all the previous year questions that we are going to discuss today based on the chapter Heredity, and I hope all of you will write the examinations very well, grab good scores and be proud of yourself, and at the end make your parents, your teachers and the whole people around you who knows you proud. So thank you everyone. All the best for everyone.